An hour into the thing, you'd expect at least another tidbit of conversation, another aphorism, another quote to please those in the know and mystify any stray tourists. Maybe you might think at the end there will even be a picture. If the purpose of Letterism, as Debord and Woolman summed it up in 1955, was to cause a, quote, fatal inflation in the arts, end of quote, then this was truly ultra-Letterism. Here a single image of what it would not matter would carry more force than all the mushroom cloud shots closing avant-garde films all over the world in 1952. A penny would truly be a fortune. The Dada Bank would make the audience rich beyond its dreams. In this setting, the final self-portrait Debord wrote into the Ion version of Hurlemont would be the second coming of Christ. So you can picture an audience giving into the event, recognizing the film's prescriptions and abiding by its orders. Certainly, as I read the final script after a year of reading various accounts of this movie without images, that was my imagined response. I caught on. It all began to seem reasonable. That was the reaction Debord wanted. And so, after more than 60 minutes of shifting white screen into black, talk into silence, he pulled the string. We are living like lost children. Our adventures incomplete, Debord said on the soundtrack. Enfants perdus. The audience would have known that he was referring to the Lettrists and to the Autul orphans, that he was using French military slang for soldiers sent on almost suicidal reconnaissance missions, that he was parodying then current sociological jargon for post-war French youth. And the audience would have known that Debord was most of all calling up the enfants perdus of Marcel Carné's 1942 film Les Visiteurs du Soir, The Night Visitors. Gilles and Dominique, young emissaries of the devil sent to destroy love on earth. Destroyers seduced by earthly love. The audience would have known that in Les Visiteurs du Soir, the devil is meant to represent Hitler, and that there was no way Debord did not know it. The film would have reached a moment of obviousness, confusion, suspension. Nous vivons en enfants perdus, nos aventures incomplètes. There followed fully 24 minutes of silence during which the screen remained black. Then, on those rare occasions when audiences or house managers allowed the work to reach its conclusion, the film ran out. Now, even allowing that it might have been lack of money or mere laziness that led Debord to scrap the images in much of the soundtrack of his Ion scenario, one can perhaps conjure up Debord's state of mind as he finally contrived his movie. After convincing an audience that it could accept an acceptable version of nothing, he would insist on the real thing. John Cage's Silent 4:33, introduced the same year as Hurlemont, was a concept, and the audience was given a performer to watch. A man sitting at a piano he did not play. Debord's film was both less, on the terms of decomposition, every additional minute was a geometric reduction, and more, 85 minutes more. Of course, it was also a joke, like the best of Marcel Marceau, an LP released in 1971 on the MGM Gone If label by Mike Curb, in 1978 elected Lieutenant Governor of California and for a time seriously discussed as a Republican candidate for the presidency, which featured two sides of silence, 19 minutes, applause, 1 minute. To experience Hurlemont might have been boring beyond description. A provocation staged in the most sterile environment, not even worth fighting over. You could pull the plug or you could leave. To read Debord's final script so many years later, to read it as an argument, as a manifesto, as a before-the-fact event taking place in the mind of its creator can be a pure shock, a pure thrill. The manifesto had its obvious clauses. The blank screen suggested that art was a trick, that any real movie one might pay money to see was full of nothing, that the letters were invisible to the dominant society, living in its shadows, working in the dark, that no matter how incomprehensible the lecherous words and unwords might be to anyone else, the blackness accompanying their silence meant that they alone had a claim on their time. But the center of Hurlement, and the key to its aesthetics, was its assembly of references and metaphors. L'Enfance du Paradis, Saint Just, the Notre Dame Scandal, Les Visiteurs du Soir, Enfants Perdus, and the odd exclamation that the art of the future would have nothing to do with the decomposition of the cinema or anything else, that art and the future would be a question of situations. I was there up in the balcony with Guy with the bags of flour, Michel Bernstein said in 1983, 31 years after the first complete screening of Debord's film, the 13 October 1952 show at the Latin Quarter Film Club. Quote, below us were all the people we knew, and Isidore Issot and Marc O, who'd broken with Issot and who we'd broken with. Before the film, Serge Bernat came on stage and delivered a wonderful speech on the cinema, pretending to be a professor. The flour was, of course, to drop on the people below. And in those days, I had a voice that could break glass. I don't know where it went, if it's smoking or drinking. It wasn't a scream, just a sound I could make. I was to howl when people began to make noise, when they began to complain. I was to make a greater noise, and I did. I can't remember if Guy and I even stayed to the finish. The last 20 minutes are silence, nothing. But I do know that Serge Bernat tried to keep people from leaving. Don't go, he said. At the end, there's something really dirty. Hurlement. Hurlement opened a route to a break with Issot, though not because the master, faced with defections over the film, disavowed his participation. In 1979, he published Contre le Cinéma Situationniste Neo-Nazi, Against Neo-Nazi Situationist Cinema, a pamphlet on Hurlement and Debord's later film, so splenetic that Issot was unable to bring himself to mention Debord by name. In 1952, Issot welcomed Hurlement into the letrist canon, with screenings of his unmovie Debord-created situations. And those incidents, riot and outrage, separating a few from a few more, suggested that if the creation of situations could replace art as everyone understood it, then the creation of situations could replace life as everyone accepted it. Dada was a marriage of prank and negation, so was Hurlement. What if one went further? What if out of art one created something that could not be returned to art? Something that was not a representation of what was or should be, but an event in itself, seeking a moment in a new language to talk about it. What if one created something that would simply go on creating of its own accord, a set of wishes translated by gestures, an ensemble of desires whose force fields would level all museums, habits, routines, all everyday walk and talk, until every moment had to be a new work of art, or nothing? This was not lettrism. In July 1952, just after the first abortive screening of Hurlement, Wollman and Debord, two certified artistes maudits, one banned by the government, the other by the public, formed a secret tendency within Issot's movement, the Lettrist International. Without quite knowing that they were about to move into their own territory, they looked for a further breach. A few months later, they found it. The occasion was the arrival in Paris of Charlie Chaplin, on tour to promote his new film, Limelight. Upon his departure from the United States and on the eve of a presidential election, during which Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate for vice president, was accusing the sitting Democratic administration of being soft on communism, Chaplin had been officially cited by the Attorney General as a subversive and barred from re-entering the country. Days after, Chaplin was received by the newly crowned Elizabeth II at the court of St. James, where, as a British subject, he performed the requisite bow. England welcomed him home. On the next leg of the tour, Europe opened its arms. In Paris, the newspapers were beside themselves. Charlotte was front page day after day. Chaplin was accepted into the Legion of Honor. He granted a round of interviews. On 29 October 1952, he held a final press conference in Paris, at the Ritz, and the Lettrist International announced its existence to the world. As the crowd outside the hotel chanted without cease for Charlotte, while Debord and Berna tried to block the doors, Woolman and Brow broke through police barriers, shouting curses and scattering leaflets. The leaflets read, "No more flat feet. Sub-Max Senate Director, Sub-Max Linder Actors, Stavisky of the Tears of Unwed Mothers and the Little Orphans of Auteuil. You are chaplain, emotional blackmailer, master singer of misfortune. The cameraman needed his deli. It's only to him that you've given your works and your good works, your charities. Because you've identified yourself with the weak and the oppressed. To attack you has been to attack the weak and the oppressed. But in the shadow of your rattan canes, some could already see the nightstick of a cop. You are he who turns the other cheek of the buttock. But for us, the young and beautiful, the only answer to suffering is revolution. We don't buy the absurd persecutions that make you out as a victim, you flat-footed Max de Visite. In France, the Immigration Service calls itself the advertising agency. The sort of press conference you gave at Cherbourg could offer no more than a piece of tripe. You have nothing to fear from the success of Limelight. Go to sleep, you fascist insect. Rake in the dough. Make it with high society. We loved it when you crawled on your stomach in front of little Elizabeth. Have a quick death. We promise you a first-class funeral. We pray that your latest film will truly be your last. The fires of the Klieg lights have melted the makeup of the so-called brilliant mime and exposed the sinister and compromised old man. Go home, Mr. Chaplin. The Letrist International. Serge Berna, Guy Ernest Debord, Jean L. Brow, Gil J. Woolman. There was an argument here, the notion that Chaplin's sentimental art, the art of city lights, any art, was emotional blackmail. A diversion of one's living strength toward an empty heaven where everything was true and nothing was possible. The argument did not exactly make the papers. Combat identified the anti-Chaplin hooligans as Letrists. Along with Pomerand and Lemaitre, Issot thus disassociated himself from the action, though in the mildest terms. In a letter to Combat, Issot noted the excessive hysteria that had greeted Chaplin, but rested his case with the argument that Chaplin's creative work in the cinema rendered him inviolate. A god was a god. Issot did not denounce his four disciples, he merely joined in the homage everyone has rendered to Chaplin. Debord and the others were not about to yield their opportunity. For the first time, they occupied the terrain of public life, and they were happy there. From Belgium, where they had gone to screen Issot's treatise, they wrote to Combat. Following our intervention against the press conference held by Chaplin at the Ritz and the bits and pieces of the tract No More Flat Feet reproduced in the newspapers, a tract which alone took a stand against this artist, Issot and his submissive graying followers have published a note disapproving of our actions in this specific circumstance in Combat. We have appreciated the significance of Chaplin's work in its own time, but we know that today novelty lies elsewhere and that truths which are no longer interesting turn into lies. Issot. The members of the Letrist International staked out their ground. We believe that the most urgent expression of freedom is the destruction of idols, especially when they claim to represent freedom. The provocative tone of our leaflet was a reaction against a unanimous and servile enthusiasm. The fact that certain Letrists, and Issot himself, have chosen to disclaim us is proof of the incomprehension which always did, and still does, separate extremists from those who no longer stand close to the edge, and separates us from those who have relinquished, quote, the bitterness of their youth, end of quote, and smile upon established glories, and separates those over 20 from those under 30. We claim sole responsibility for a text we alone have signed. We ourselves disclaim no one. Indignation leaves us utterly indifferent. To be reactionary is not a matter of degree. We abandon our detractors to the anonymous crowd of the easily offended. Ignoring the law mandating a right of reply for disputes aired in the press, no doubt because of the ephemerality of the whole affair once Chaplin took his leave of France, Combat did not publish the statement. The anti-Chaplin intervention was swallowed in the publicity of its moment, 2 days' gossip in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. At most, it was a small-time replay of the Notre Dame affair on the trickier terrain of popular culture. It did not have the same effect. Neither Marx nor anyone else had ever suggested that the criticism of popular culture was the prerequisite of all criticism. The new members of the Lecherist International swiftly vanished into their own lives, into their own unformed activities, into the obscurity affirmed in Hurlement un faveur de Sade. They did not share Assau's taste for publicity, and they would not really emerge for almost 6 years when the first number of International Situationiste appeared across Western Europe. Young guys, young girls read its last page, facing a photo of a blonde woman, Sapine on horseback, raising her breasts into the air. Talent wanted for getting out of this and playing no special qualifications. Whether you're beautiful or you're bright, history could be on your side with the Situationists. No telephone. Write or turn up. 32 Rue de la Montagne Genevieve, Paris, 5E.